How a Forged Signature Rewrote Our Family's Will. The signature on my father's final will was perfect, and that is precisely how I knew it was a forgery. For years, his hand had carried the tremor of a long life, a story of hard work etched into every wavering line. This signature, however, was a sterile, soulless imitation, and it told a story of profound betrayal. The library was the last room, the one Arthur had put off for as long as was decent. It was his father's sanctuary, a place where the air still held the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco, old leather, and the slow decay of paper. For a month, he had methodically dismantled a life, sorting through tool sheds and attics, but this room felt like a final violation, a trespass on memory itself. He worked with the quiet precision of a retired architect, creating neat stacks of books for donation, for family, for disposal. It was a job, nothing more. He refused to let sentimentality stall the process. He was running his hand along a row of worn spines when his fingers stopped on Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The leather was cracked like dry riverbeds, the gold leaf of the title all but gone. His father had read from it nearly every night, his finger tracing the Stoic lines as if they were blueprints for a well-lived life. Arthur pulled it from the shelf, its familiar weight of comfort in his hands. He opened it, not to read, but simply to feel the connection one last time before placing it in the box destined for his own study. As the pages fanned open, a small sheaf of folded paper, yellowed and brittle at the creases, slipped from between the chapters on Providence and Pain and fell silently onto the Persian rug. He bent to retrieve it, assuming it was a forgotten bookmark or a newspaper clipping. Unfolding it, he saw the familiar letterhead of the family solicitor, dated 5 years prior. Typed across the top were 2 words: draft copy. It was a will. An old one, unsigned and clearly superseded. Arthur felt a flicker of annoyance, another piece of administrative clutter his father had failed to discard. He scanned the first few pages, standard bequests, boilerplate legal language. He was about to fold it back up and toss it into the recycling bin when his eyes caught the heading for Article 4 Disposition of Ellison Son Construction. He stopped. The air in the room grew still and heavy. He read the clause once, then a second time. It laid out a detailed plan for the business to be placed into a managed trust, with profits to be shared equally among his children, himself, Thomas, and Clara, and a separate portion set aside for his grandchildren's education. The language was his father's, full of talk about legacy, stewardship, and responsibility. It was a plan to keep the family tethered to the company, and to each other. A cold dread, slick and unwelcome, crept up his spine. This was not what the final will had said. He could still see the conference room, the polished mahogany table reflecting the strained faces of his siblings. He remembered the solicitor's dry voice reading the final, binding document, the one signed with his father's uncharacteristically firm signature. That will had been brutally simple. The business, in its entirety, was left to Thomas. Clara had received the token sum that was an insult disguised as a bequest, and he, Arthur, had been left the family home he already lived in. He had accepted it as his father's inscrutable final wish, a painful but binding decision. But this felt like the man he knew. The man who built things to last, especially his family. The memory of Thomas' barely concealed smirk and Clara's silent, streaming tears returned to him, no longer as tragic family drama, but as scenes from a meticulously staged play. He stood there, the unsigned document trembling slightly in his hand, the quiet library no longer a sanctuary but a chamber of secrets. The whisper in the ink was faint, but it was there, a ghost of his father's true intent, and it spoke of a betrayal so profound it had been hiding in plain sight. The old paper in his hand was a key, unlocking a room in his memory he had sealed shut. Holding the draft, Arthur felt the dusty silence of the library dissolve, replaced by the suffocating quiet of Mr. Davies' law office from 3 weeks before. The memory was sharp, clinical, rendered in the unforgiving clarity of hindsight. The room had been a cliché of legal solemnity, walls of mahogany, paneled bookshelves filled with statutes no one read, the air thick with the scent of leather and floor polish. It was a stage set for pronouncements of gravity, a room of polished surfaces designed to reflect nothing back. He remembered Clara, her face pale and drawn, twisting a handkerchief in her lap until the delicate fabric was a wrinkled knot. She had always been the most fragile of them, feeling every slight as a physical blow. Across from her sat Thomas, a study in quiet composure. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his expression one of sober respect that didn't quite reach his eyes. Arthur had mistaken it for grief then. Now he saw it for what it was, the placid confidence of a man who already knew the outcome. Mr. Davies, a man whose features seemed to have been eroded by decades of other people's misfortune, had cleared his throat and begun to read. His voice was a dry monotone, stripping the legal jargon of all emotion as he dispatched their father's life into neat, divisible parcels. Arthur listened, a dull ache of loss pressing down on him. When the solicitor reached Article 4, the air in the room seemed to thin, to crackle with anticipation. The words fell into the silence like stones into a deep well. And to my youngest son, Thomas Ellison, I bequeath sole ownership and controlling interest of Ellison Son Construction, its assets, its holdings, and its future endeavors. A small, broken sound escaped Clara's lips. It was the only noise in the room. Thomas didn't move, didn't even look at her. He simply stared ahead, his jaw set. Arthur felt a surge of disbelief, a sharp, bitter anger on his sister's behalf, but he said nothing. A father's will was a final, unarguable statement. They were there to listen, not to contest. The rest was a blur of minor bequests, Clara's pittance, his own inheritance of the house, details that merely salted the wound. When Davies finished, he pushed the document across the gleaming table for their inspection. If you would all just verify the signature. Thomas signed the executor paperwork with a swift, decisive flick of a fountain pen. Clara couldn't seem to hold her pen steady, her own signature a jagged, tear-stained mark. When the will was passed to Arthur, he found he wasn't looking at the text anymore. His gaze was fixed on the bottom of the last page, on the name scrawled above the typed words Robert Ellison. It was perfect. Too perfect. As an architect, Arthur's life was a study of lines. He understood the integrity of a true line, the subtle imperfections that gave a structure character. He knew his father's hand, a script that had become more complex and faltering with age and illness. In his last years, his signature was a story, a slight tremor in the R, a loss of pressure in the final loop of the N. It was the script of a man whose strength was failing but whose will remained. The signature on this document was flawless. The pressure was even, the slant uniform, the loops geometrically pure. It was not a signature, it was a fabrication. It was a line drawn by a steady, confident hand mimicking a trembling one, and in that precision, it betrayed itself. It lacked the essential, human flaw of its author. It was a beautiful, soulless lie. At that moment, in that polished room, he had pushed the thought away, blaming his grief for creating conspiracies. But now, back in the quiet of his father's library with the ghost of a different will in his hand, the suspicion returned, no longer a fleeting shadow but a cold, hard-edged certainty. The will reading had not been an ending. It had been a coronation built upon a crime. Grief had been a fog, but now a cold, clear purpose burned it away. Arthur left his father's library, the draft will tucked securely inside his jacket, and walked across the hall to his own study. Here, there was no scent of pipe tobacco or decaying leather, only the clean, sharp smell of drafting paper, graphite, and the faint metallic tang of his tools. This was his space, a room built on logic, angles, and the unwavering truth of a well-drawn line. In the chaos of his family's collapse, it was the only ground that felt solid. He spent the next hour sifting through the boxes he had already brought from his father's house. He worked not as a grieving son, but as a man assembling a case. He searched for one thing: his father's hand. From a steel filing cabinet, he pulled old building contracts from the 80s, the signatures at the bottom bold and flourishing, full of the swagger of a man building an empire. From a shoebox labeled keepsakes, he unearthed birthday cards sent to him at university, the scrawled messages of love signed with a familiar, hurried hand. He found letters his father had written to his late mother, the script softer, more intimate. And from a folder of recent bank statements, he carefully extracted a canceled check made out to the pharmacy, dated just 2 weeks before his father's final decline. This, he knew, would be the most crucial piece. He carried the collection of documents to his drafting table and switched on the articulated lamp, flooding the surface with a bright, clinical light that left no room for shadows or sentiment. He laid them out in chronological order, creating a timeline of a life told in ink. The photocopied signature from the official will, which he had requested from the solicitor under a plausible pretext, was placed at the very end. The effect was immediate and jarring. He leaned closer, picking up his magnifying glass. The early signatures were a force of nature, confident and unbroken. The capital R in Robert was an anchor, a statement of intent. Through the 90s and early 2000s, the script relaxed, showing the ease of long practice. Then came the change. Around 2015, a slight hesitation appeared in the cross of the T. By 2018, the loops of the LS in Ellison were no longer perfect ovals but slightly jagged. It was subtle, a story only visible to someone who had studied the original for a lifetime. He picked up the last birthday card he ever received. "Happy birthday, Art. Your old man is proud of you." The handwriting was frail, the pressure uneven, as if the effort of holding the pen was a battle fought with every letter. The signature below it was a halting, wavering thing, yet it was undeniably alive. It was his father's struggle, his stubborn refusal to give in, rendered in blue ink. Then, his eyes moved to the signature on the will. Under the unforgiving glare of the lamp and the power of the lens, it was an obscenity. There was no life in it. The lines were smooth where they should have trembled. The pen pressure was unnaturally consistent, with none of the faint starts and stops that marked his father's later writing. It wasn't a signature written, it was a shake drawn. It was a hollow echo, a traced effigy of the real thing. The stark contrast on the white table was not just a discrepancy, it was an accusation. A quiet, icy resolve settled over him. This was not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It was a matter of fact, of evidence. His feelings, his anger, his sense of betrayal, were irrelevant. They were noise. What he needed now was an expert, someone who could translate this visual history of a life into the cold, irrefutable language of a legal finding. He carefully gathered the documents, placing the will's signature and the final, fragile check into a separate protective sleeve. He would not speak to Thomas. He would not alarm Clara. This was a burden he would carry alone, a foundation he would lay in secret, block by methodical block. The office of Ms. Eleanor Albright was located in a nondescript building downtown, sandwiched between a tax accountant and a dental lab. There was no grand sign, only a small brass plaque next to the door that read E. Albright, Forensic Document Examination. It was the kind of place you would never notice unless you had a very specific, and likely very unpleasant, reason to be looking for it. Arthur had found her name through an old colleague, a retired litigator who had simply said, "If a line is lying, Eleanor will know." Miss Albright was a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her office was less a legal space and more a laboratory. Microscopes stood alongside computers, and strange lighting apparatuses were clamped to desks. The only decoration on the sterile white walls was a framed diploma and a chart detailing the evolution of the modern alphabet. She greeted Arthur with a firm handshake and gestured for him to lay his documents on a large, clean metal table. She didn't ask about the family drama. She didn't inquire about his grief. She was interested only in the evidence. "The questioned document," she said, her voice calm and professional, "and the known exemplars." Arthur slid the plastic sleeve containing the will's signature across the table. Then, he placed the birthday card, the contract, and the cancelled check beside it. He said nothing, allowing the paper to speak for him. Miss Albright put on a pair of glasses and examined the documents with her naked eye for a long moment, her head tilted slightly. Then, without a word, she carried the questioned signature and the cancelled check to a large digital microscope in the corner. She worked in silence for nearly 20 minutes, adjusting lenses, capturing images on her monitor, and making meticulous notes on a legal pad. Arthur sat in the uncomfortable guest chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing a surgical procedure on a stranger. The fury and pain that had propelled him here had receded, replaced by a tense, clinical anticipation. Finally, Miss Albright turned from her equipment, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Ellison," she began, gesturing him over to the monitor. "A signature is a habit. It's a series of muscle memories performed at speed. A forger, on the other hand, is drawing a picture. They are focused on the form, not the motion. And that difference is always visible." On the screen was a massively magnified image of the signature from the will. "Look here," she said, pointing with the tip of a stylus. "These are what we call pen lifts." She indicated a spot in the middle of the flowing O in Robert. "A natural writer wouldn't key stop here. But a forger does. They lift the pen, almost imperceptibly, to check their work against the model they're copying. Under magnification, we see the tiny break in the ink." She clicked a button, and an image of his father's signature from the check appeared beside it. The lines were wavering, yes, but they were fluid, unbroken. "Now, observe the pressure," she continued, switching to another set of images that looked like topographical maps of the ink lines. "Your father, especially in this later exemplar, had a rhythmic pressure. He pressed harder on the downstrokes and lighter on the upstrokes. It's the natural cadence of writing." She then pointed to the will's signature. "This one is almost entirely uniform. It has a dead quality, a consistent, heavy pressure that indicates a slow, careful tracing motion. The writer isn't writing, they are concentrating on staying on a line." She saved the most damning evidence for last. She showed him the ink itself. "Your father favored a fountain pen, correct?" Arthur nodded. "Fountain pen ink is water-based. When it hits the fibers of the paper, it feathers out ever so slightly at the edges. See?" She pointed to the microscopic bleeding along the edges of the authentic signature. The questioned document was signed with a gel-ink ballpoint. A completely different instrument. It was chosen, I suspect, because it doesn't skip and allows for a smooth, slow line, ideal for a forger. She switched off the monitor and turned to face him, her professional demeanor softening with a sliver of human empathy. "Mr. Ellison, in my professional opinion, the signature on this will is a forgery. And not a particularly sophisticated one. It was designed to pass a cursory glance, not expert scrutiny." The words landed not with a crash, but with a quiet, final thud. It was the sound of a door locking. The last vestiges of doubt, the faint hope that he had been wrong, evaporated. The suspicion that had been a whisper in his father's library was now a cold, irrefutable fact, certified by science. The grief for his father remained, a permanent ache in his chest, but it was now joined by something else, a quiet, steely resolve that settled deep in his bones. This was no longer just about a stolen inheritance. It was about defending a man's life, his name, and the truth of his final wishes from the people who were supposed to honor them. Miss Albright's certified report felt like a block of ice in Arthur's briefcase. It was a foundation of fact, cold and unyielding, but a foundation is useless without a structure built upon it. A forged signature was one thing, a legally filed and notarized will was another. The weak point in the conspiracy, the joint that had to be stressed to see the fracture, was the notary, Mr. Henderson. Henderson had been a fixture at family gatherings for years, a man who built a career on appearing trustworthy while nursing a glass of his father's best scotch. He was the official witness, the seal of legitimacy on the lie. To confront him directly would be foolish, inviting denial and giving the conspirators time to cover their tracks. Arthur needed leverage. He needed to understand the man's motivation, and in his experience, that usually followed a trail of money. He found the investigator, a man named Chen, through the same legal channels that had led him to Miss Albright. Chen's office was even more Spartan than the document examiner's, containing little more than a desk, 2 chairs, and a computer that hummed with quiet efficiency. Arthur was brief and direct. He laid out the situation in sterile terms, omitting the family connection. A questioned legal document. A potentially compromised notary. He wanted a discreet financial profile of Mr. Henderson, focusing on the weeks surrounding the will's signing. He made it clear he was looking for any unusual income, any sudden settling of debts, and any financial link, no matter how tenuous, to his brother, Thomas Ellison. He provided Chen with their names and details, wrote a substantial check for the retainer, and left. There was nothing more to do but wait. The waiting was a unique form of torment. He went about the grim business of sorting his father's effects, the task now imbued with a sense of righteous anger. Every object, every memory, was a testament to the man his family had betrayed. He answered calls from Clara, her voice always sounding fragile, on the verge of tears. He listened to her lament her meager inheritance and her husband Mark's growing frustration, and for the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of impatience with her sorrow. He fielded one brief, sterile call from Thomas about the business, his brother's tone oozing a proprietary confidence that set Arthur's teeth on edge. He played his part, the passive, grieving older brother, while a cold, methodical campaign was being waged in the shadows. A week later, Chen called and asked to meet. They sat in a quiet corner of a bustling coffee shop, the anonymity a comfort. Chen slid a slim manila folder across the table. He was a man of few words, letting the data speak for itself. "There's no direct link to your brother," Chen began, his voice low. "I ran a full check on Thomas Ellison. His finances are clean, almost aggressively so. No large withdrawals, no unusual transfers. If he paid Henderson, he used a method that leaves no trace, which is unlikely." Arthur's heart sank. It was the one connection he had been certain of, the central pillar of his theory. Without it, the structure collapsed. "So, nothing." "I didn't say that," Chen corrected. "Henderson came into money. $50,000, deposited in cash installments over 2 weeks, starting 3 days after the will was signed. He used it to pay off a significant gambling debt." "Where did it come from?" Arthur asked, leaning forward. "That's the difficult part. It wasn't a transfer. It was cash. Untraceable." Chen paused, taking a sip of his water. "But people who deal in that kind of cash often have other secrets." I widened the net. I looked at his known associates, his phone records, and eventually, his offshore holdings. He's not a very sophisticated man. He has a small, undeclared account in the Cayman Islands. Chen opened the folder. Inside was a single bank statement. 2 months ago, that account received a wire transfer for $100,000. Arthur stared at the paper, his mind racing. From who? An investment holding company. It took some work to peel back the layers on that one, Chen said, pointing to a name on the page. The company is a shell, but the sole director, the ultimate beneficial owner, is a man named Mark Peterson. The name struck Arthur like a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. Mark. His sister Clara's husband. The ambitious, perpetually dissatisfied real estate broker who always felt he'd married into a family that didn't appreciate his genius. It wasn't Thomas' blunt force greed, but something more insidious, a venom injected into the weakest part of the family. The betrayal wasn't a simple line from brother to brother, it was a complex web, and his devastated sister was trapped in the middle of it, either as a fool or a co-conspirator. The discovery brought no satisfaction, only a profound, sickening ache. The wound was deeper and more infected than he could have ever imagined. The drive to Clara's suburban home was the longest 20 minutes of Arthur's life. He felt no rage, no burning desire for confrontation. Instead, a heavy, surgical calm had settled over him. He was not an avenging brother on his way to accuse a sister. He was an architect arriving at a demolition site, carrying a structural report that condemned the entire building. In his briefcase lay 2 documents: Ms. Albright's forensic analysis and a copy of a single bank transfer. They were all the tools he needed. He found Clara in her sun-drenched kitchen, the picture of domestic tranquility, worrying over a wilting orchid. She seemed surprised to see him, offering a weak smile and a cup of tea. He declined, his voice quieter than he intended. "Clara, we need to talk. Somewhere private." Her smile faltered, replaced by a familiar look of anxiety. She led him to the formal living room, a space so pristine it looked as though no one had ever lived in it. They sat on opposing sofas, the polished coffee table a chasm between them. Arthur didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and laid the first folder on the table. "This is a certified report from a forensic document examiner," he said, his tone level, factual. "It analyzes the signature on Dad's will." Clara stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "Arthur, what is this? I don't understand." "She found it was a forgery," Arthur stated, letting the word hang in a silent room. He watched her face for a reaction. He saw confusion, a flicker of fear, but not the shock of genuine innocence. It was made with a different type of pen, by a hand that was tracing, not writing. "It isn't his." That's impossible," she stammered, her hand flying to her throat. "Mr. Henderson was there. It was all official." Arthur let her denial fade into the stillness. Then he placed the second document beside the first. It was the bank statement from the Cayman Islands account. He said nothing, simply pushed it closer to her, his finger resting on the line item showing the transfer and the name of the owner, Mark Peterson. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The color drained from Clara's face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. Her eyes darted from the paper to Arthur's impassive expression. The carefully constructed facade of her life shattered in a single, silent moment. A choked sob broke from her, then another. She crumpled, folding in on herself as if her spine had dissolved. "He told me it was for an investment," she whispered through her tears, the words tumbling out in a broken, desperate torrent. "A silent partner thing. He said he was just moving money around." Arthur remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He had to know if she was a participant or a pawn. "He said Dad never respected him," she continued, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "That he never respected me. He said Thomas would run the company into the ground and we'd be left with nothing. He said this was the only way to secure our future, to get what we deserved." The confession poured out of her, a story of Mark's poisonous whispers, of him preying on her insecurities, her lifelong feeling of being overshadowed by her brothers. He had orchestrated the entire scheme, finding a forger and buying Henderson's cooperation. She swore she didn't know the full extent of it, that she just went along, too weak and too afraid to stand up to him. As she sobbed, Arthur felt a profound, weary sadness. This wasn't a victory. It was the confirmation of a rot that had consumed his family from within. He took his phone from his pocket and placed it on the table. "Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Mark has committed multiple felonies. When this comes out, they will come for him, and they will come for you as an accomplice." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. "I am going to record what you just told me," he explained calmly. "This is not to punish you. This is to protect you. It will be your testimony that you were manipulated, that you acted under his influence. It's the only thing that will separate your mistake from his crime. Do you understand?" She stared at him, tears streaming down her face, and then gave a slow, shuddering nod. Arthur pressed the record button. He asked her to start from the beginning, and as the sterile living room filled with the sound of his sister's tearful, damning confession, he knew that he had secured the weapon he needed, but had shattered his family beyond any hope of repair. The recording of Clara's confession was a volatile asset, a piece of evidence so potent it could either be a scalpel or a sledgehammer. Arthur knew which one he needed. He left his sister's house with the quiet finality of a doctor leaving a terminal patient, the diagnosis confirmed and the grim prognosis understood. The goal was no longer discovery, it was control. He met with his lawyer the next morning. Not Mr. Davies, the family solicitor who was either incompetent or complicit, but a new man, a litigator named Elias Vance whom Arthur had retained the day he received Ms. Albright's report. Vance's office was modern, all glass and steel, a world away from the musty mahogany of the old guard. He was a man who understood that law was not just about precedent, it was about leverage. Arthur sat opposite him at a stark glass table and laid out his entire case. He spoke with the dispassionate precision of an architect presenting a blueprint. He started with the draft found in the book, moved to the flawless signature, detailed Ms. Albright's forensic findings, explained Chen's financial investigation into the notary, and concluded with the Cayman Islands bank transfer linking everything to Mark. Finally, he placed his phone on the table. "And this," Arthur said, "is my sister's full confession, recorded yesterday. She details her husband's manipulation and her own role in the conspiracy." Vance listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. He was a portrait of intense concentration. When Arthur finished, the lawyer was silent for a full minute, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the city skyline visible through the panoramic window. "We have them," Vance said at last, his voice a low, confident hum. "On charges of fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. We could take this to the district attorney today, and they would be indicted by the end of the month. It would be a public spectacle. The Ellison name would be synonymous with scandal for a generation." Arthur shook his head. "No. That's not what I want. My father spent his life building that name. I won't be the one to tear it down to settle a score." "I thought you might say that," Vance replied, a flicker of a smile on his lips. He leaned forward, all business. "A public trial is messy. It's a declaration of war. What you need is not a war, you need a treaty of unconditional surrender. You want the outcome of a trial without the trial itself." "Exactly," Arthur affirmed. "I don't want revenge. I want restoration. I want my father's real will, or at least the intent of it, honored. And I want them to walk away with nothing but the shame of what they did." Vance began to sketch a plan on a legal pad, his pen moving with swift, decisive strokes. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity and brutality. It was not a lawsuit, it was an ambush. "We don't file a thing," Vance explained. "We don't alert them. We call a meeting. Here. In this room. We summon Thomas, Mark, and Clara on a pretext of discussing the estate's final distribution. We let them walk in here believing they have won." He tapped the pen on his notes. "We begin with the soft evidence, the draft you found. We present it as a moral argument, your father's true wishes. They will scoff at it. They will feel secure. Then," he continued, his voice hardening, "you will cede the floor to your expert. We will have Ms. Albright here in person. She will present her forensic findings calmly, clinically. She will methodically dismantle their lie with science. That is when the foundation will crack." Vance leaned back, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "They will panic. Deny. Bluster. And at the peak of their indignation, you will play your sister's confession. The effect will be absolute. In that moment of total psychological collapse, we present them with our terms." He slid the legal pad across the table. On it, he had written 2 words: settlement or prosecution. "We will have a settlement agreement drafted and ready. It will nullify the fraudulent will, cede all their claims to the business and estate, and include a non-disclosure clause so airtight they won't be able to whisper the family name without breaching it. They will be given one choice sign, or we walk across the street and hand this entire file to the DA. No negotiation. No discussion." Arthur looked at the plan. It was cold. It was precise. It was a perfectly engineered piece of legal machinery designed for a single purpose: to corner and disarm. It offered no room for rage, only for the inevitable application of pressure until the objective was achieved. It was a blade sharpened for a single, surgical cut. "Do it," Arthur said. The conference room was a cage of glass and chrome, overlooking the city from 20 stories up. It was a place for high-stakes negotiations, a neutral ground designed to intimidate. Arthur, Vance, and Ms. Albright sat on one side of the long glass table, a silent triumvirate of fact and law. They had arrived early, setting up a large monitor at the head of the table. Ms. Albright, calm and professional, arranged her files as if preparing for a university lecture. Vance exuded a predatory stillness. Arthur felt a cold, hard knot in his stomach, the quiet dread before a necessary demolition. Thomas and Mark arrived together, radiating an aura of success and impatience. Thomas, in his role as the new head of Ellison Son, looked upon the meeting as a tedious formality. Mark, ever the opportunist, wore a suit that was a shade too expensive, his smile a tight, confident slash. They took their seats opposite Arthur, their casual arrogance a stark contrast to the room's tension. Clara arrived last, a ghost in their midst. She was pale and thin, her eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the floor. She sat as far from her husband as possible, a small, isolated island of misery. She did not look at Arthur. Vance began the meeting with a bland, procedural opening, thanking them for coming to finalize the estate's affairs. Then, he nodded to Arthur. "Before we proceed," Arthur began, his voice steady, "I found something while clearing out Dad's library." He slid a document across the glass table. It was the unsigned draft will. "I believe this reflects our father's true intentions for the company and for us. It speaks of legacy, of family, of keeping us all together." Thomas picked it up, glanced at the first page, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. "An unsigned draft, Arthur. It's a meaningless piece of paper. People change their minds. Dad obviously did." He tossed it back onto the table. "The final, notarized will is what matters. Let's get on with it." Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair. "He's right. This is just sentimentality. The law is the law." Arthur held their gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said softly. "The final document is what matters. Which is why I felt it was important to ensure its legitimacy." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I hired a specialist to examine it." He turned to Ms. Albright. Ms. Albright is a court-certified forensic document examiner. I've asked her here to share her findings. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The casual confidence on Thomas and Mark's faces curdled into wary confusion. Ms. Albright, without any preamble, turned on the monitor. The first image that appeared was a massively enlarged photograph of their father's signature from the will, every line and curve rendered in stark, high-definition detail. A person's signature is a dynamic action, a product of habit and muscle memory, she began, her voice the epitome of calm authority. She used a laser pointer to trace the lines on the screen. A forgery, however, is a drawing. It is slow, deliberate, and it leaves behind artifacts of its own creation. For the next 10 minutes, she delivered a quiet, methodical vivisection of the signature. She showed them the unnatural pen lifts in the middle of smooth curves, evidence of a forger pausing to check their work. She displayed topographical charts of the ink, revealing the dead, uniform pressure of a slow trace, contrasting it with the rhythmic, living pulse of Robert Ellison's genuine handwriting from checks and letters. With each new slide, with every calm, scientific explanation, the tension in the room ratcheted tighter. Thomas' face hardened into a mask of stone, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Mark began to fidget, his gaze darting between the screen, Ms. Albright, and Vance's impassive face. Clara seemed to shrink into her chair, her eyes shut tight as if she could will herself invisible. The final slide showed a microscopic analysis of the ink itself. "Your father used a fountain pen," Ms. Albright stated. "The ink in his known signatures shows the characteristic feathering of water-based ink on paper fiber. She clicked, and an image of the will's signature appeared. This ink has a polymer base, consistent with a gel pen. It's a completely different writing instrument. She switched off the monitor, leaving the damning images burned into the silence. In my expert opinion, she concluded, her voice leaving no room for doubt, the signature of Robert Ellison on this document is a simulation. A forgery. The silence that followed Ms. Albright's verdict was thick and suffocating. It lasted only a moment before Mark shattered it. He shot to his feet, his face flushed with a furious, blotchy red. This is insane. An absolute fabrication. He sputtered, jabbing a finger toward Ms. Albright. You can pay an expert to say anything. We have a legal, notarized document. This is nothing but a desperate attempt by a disgruntled brother to steal what's rightfully Thomas. Thomas, finding his voice, quickly joined the chorus. He's right. This is libelous. Arthur, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's over. We're leaving. He made a move to stand, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. Vance held up a hand, a gesture of calm that was more commanding than a shout. Please, gentlemen. Sit down. We have one more piece of information to consider. Arthur reached into his coat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He retrieved his phone and placed it in the center of the glass table. He looked directly at Clara, whose face was now buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then his gaze shifted to Mark, whose blustering outrage faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. Arthur pressed a single button. Clara's voice, thin and reedy, filled the room. It was distorted by tears, but her words were horrifyingly clear. He told me it was for an investment. He said Dad never respected me. He said this was the only way to secure our future, to get what we deserved. The recorded confession played on, an unspooling litany of Mark's manipulation and the conspiracy's architecture. It detailed the hiring of the forger, the coercion, the payment to Henderson, every sordid block of their fraudulent enterprise. An absolute, profound silence descended upon the room. It was heavier than before, a dead weight of guilt and exposure. Mark sank back into his chair as if his strings had been cut, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. Thomas stared at the phone, then at Clara, then back at the phone, the color draining from his face. The angry denials, the self-righteous indignation, it all evaporated, leaving behind only the raw, ugly truth. They were caught. Utterly and completely. Vance let the silence hang for a long moment, allowing the full weight of their predicament to settle upon them. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and sharp as fractured ice. What you have just heard, he said, addressing Thomas and Mark, is your sister's testimony. Combined with Ms. Albright's forensic report and our evidence of a six-figure payment from Mr. Peterson's offshore account to the will's notary, we have a clear and prosecutable case. Forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury. The list is extensive. The district attorney would be very interested. He slid a thick, leather-bound document from his briefcase and pushed it into the center of the table. However, Mr. Ellison's primary goal is not punitive. It is to restore his father's legacy. He tapped the cover of the document. This is a settlement agreement. It is not a negotiation. He outlined the terms with brutal efficiency. The fraudulent will would be declared null and void. Thomas would immediately renounce any and all claim to Ellison's Sun Construction and any other asset from the estate beyond a minor personal bequest outlined in their father's original draft. Mark and Clara would renounce their claims entirely. All parties would sign a permanent, binding non-disclosure agreement. You have two options, Vance concluded, his eyes locking onto Thomas, then Mark. You can sign this agreement right now, and this matter ends in this room. You walk away. Or, you can refuse. In which case, Miss Albright and I will take a walk to the courthouse, and you can explain your actions to a grand jury. The choice is yours. You have 5 minutes. There was no discussion. There was no argument. There was only the low, ragged sound of Mark's breathing and the sight of Thomas Ellison, the confident new owner of a construction empire, visibly crumbling under the weight of his own greed. The gambit was over. All that was left was the sound of surrender. No one spoke during the 5 minutes Vance had allotted. The only sound was the rustle of paper as Thomas, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and defeat, read through the settlement agreement. Mark sat motionless, a hollowed-out man, his gaze fixed on his wife, who refused to meet his eyes. It was Clara who moved first. She rose on unsteady legs, walked to the table, and signed the document with a pen Vance provided. Her signature was a small, spidery mark, an addendum of shame. Thomas followed. He signed with a vicious, angry slash of ink, a final, impotent act of defiance. He threw the pen down on the glass table, the clatter echoing in the silent room, then turned and walked out without a word, Akin leaving his abdication. Mark, the architect of the whole affair, was the last to sign. He moved like a man in a dream, his signature a barely legible scrawl. He looked at Arthur, his eyes pleading for something, understanding, pity, a reprieve, but Arthur's face was a mask of cold resolve. Mark left, and a moment later, a process server hired by Vance stepped into the room and handed him an envelope. The divorce papers from Clara. The final door slamming shut. The aftermath was a flurry of sterile legal activity. The fraudulent will was nullified. A new probate process was initiated, guided by the terms of the settlement, which mirrored the intent of the original draft Arthur had found. As the eldest son and now the de facto executor, Arthur took temporary control of Ellison Sun Construction. It was a role he had never wanted, a world of contracts and supply chains he had gladly left behind for the clean logic of architecture. But he accepted the duty, not for power, but for stewardship. His first and only task was to establish the trust his father had envisioned, a structure that would protect the company from any single individual's greed and ensure the future for his and his siblings' children. The legacy was secure. Justice, or something resembling it, had been served. Thomas was exiled from the company he had tried to steal, left with only a modest inheritance that would seem a pittance compared to the empire he had lost. He disappeared, moving to another state without a word of goodbye. Mark was stripped of his ambitions and his marriage, left to face the financial and personal ruin of his own making. And Clara, penitent and broken, began the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life outside the shadow of her husband's influence and her own weakness. The family business was safe. The assets were protected. The grandchildren's futures were guaranteed. By every objective measure, Arthur had won. He had defended his father's name and restored his true legacy. Yet, as he sat alone in his father's old office, the grand oak desk cleared of Thomas' brief and illegitimate reign, he felt no triumph. He looked around the room, at the photographs on the wall, pictures of family holidays, of dedications at newly finished buildings, of 3 smiling children standing beside a proud father. It was a history of a family that no longer existed. He had acted out of necessity, a defensive response to a profound betrayal. He had wielded the truth like a weapon, with precision and control, never succumbing to rage. He had maintained the moral high ground. But the victory had come at the cost of a shared past and any hope of a shared future. The family portrait was irrevocably fractured. The next time they gathered, there would be an empty chair for Thomas. There would be a void where Mark had been. The connections that had once defined them, love, loyalty, shared history, had been severed by greed and deceit. The structure he had fought to save was standing, stronger than ever, but the family it was meant to house was gone. 6 months had passed. The seasons had turned, and the raw, jagged edges of the conflict had been worn smooth by the relentless abrasion of time. The trust was established, managed by a competent board that answered to Arthur. Ellison Sun Construction was stable, its future secure for a generation of grandchildren who were still too young to understand the battle that had been fought for them. The legal documents were filed, the account settled. The war was over. Arthur found himself drawn, more and more, to his father's workshop. It was the one place that felt untainted, a space that predated the dissection and would outlast the fallout. The air was thick with the ghost sense of his childhood, the sharp perfume of pine shavings, the metallic bite of lubricating oil, the earthy smell of sawdust. Light streamed through the high, dusty windows, illuminating the quiet order of the room. Saws hung from pegs in precise gradations. Chisels lay in their leather rolls, their honed edges gleaming. On the main workbench, a film of fine dust had settled over everything, a soft gray blanket over dormant potential. He ran a hand over the scarred surface of the workbench, tracing the gouges and nicks left by decades of creation. Each mark was a story, a memory of his father's hands, strong, calloused, and unfailingly honest, shaping wood into something useful and true. These tools had built cabinets and cradles, repaired chairs and framed houses. They were instruments of assembly, of joining, of making things whole. The irony was a physical weight in Arthur's chest. He had wielded facts and laws with the same precision his father had wielded these tools, but his work had not been one of creation. It had been a careful, necessary demolition. He picked up a heavy mallet, its wooden head darkened with age and its handle worn smooth to the shape of his father's grip. He had won. He had protected this legacy of wood and steel, of concrete and capital. He had honored his father's true intent. Clara called him occasionally, her voice small and hesitant, filled with a gratitude that was painful for both of them. She was rebuilding, finding a strength she never knew she possessed now that she was free from Mark's poisonous influence. Of Thomas, there was nothing. A brother, erased from his life as cleanly as a line from a blueprint. There was no joy in this outcome. No sense of triumph. The victory he had secured was a sterile, architectural thing, a structure with perfect integrity, but cold and empty. He had preserved the house but lost the family that was meant to live in it. He had fought not for revenge, but for restoration, and had succeeded. But looking around the quiet workshop, at the tools meant to build a future, he understood the profound cost. His actions had been a necessary defense. A betrayal like the one orchestrated by Mark and enabled by Thomas was a sickness that, left unchecked, would have consumed everything his father had built. He had been forced to act, to excise the disease to save the patient. He had done so without rage, moving with the cold, methodical purpose of a surgeon. Yet, the patient was scarred, the phantom limbs of his lost siblings an ache that would never fully fade. The true tragedy, he realized, was not in the fight, but in the fact that the fight was ever necessary. True justice, the kind administered in courtrooms and law offices, could restore assets and punish wrongdoing. It could enforce a consequence. But it could not heal the fundamental wound, the terrible knowledge of what the people he loved were capable of. It could not unforge the signature, nor could it erase the moment he understood that his brother and sister had valued money more than honor, more than family, more than their father's memory. That was a damage beyond repair. He placed the mallet back in its spot on the workbench, his movements precise. The dust swirled in the afternoon light, motes of the past dancing in the stillness. He had done what he had to do. He had defended his father's life, and in doing so, had accepted a life of quiet, solitary stewardship over its remains. The war was won, but the peace felt an awful lot like loss. It all began with a signature that was too perfect, a flawless lie that erased the story of a father's life told through his wavering hand. Arthur's journey wasn't about revenge, it was about restoring that imperfect, authentic truth. In the end, he saved his father's legacy, but it serves as a heavy reminder that some victories leave us standing alone in the quiet aftermath, wondering if the cost of justice was the very family it was meant to protect. We hope this story from Content Channel resonated with you as much as it did with us. It's filled with difficult choices that don't have easy answers. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you were in Arthur's position, would you have confronted Clara first to secure her confession, knowing the pain it would cause, or would you have pursued a different path to expose the truth? Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with another story soon, where we explore what happens when the crooked notary who witnessed the crime decides that his silence is worth more than he was paid for it.